He had almost forgotten what silence felt like. In Dimension 35C, silence was not the absence of sound, but something alive, something that breathed slowly through the air, like the hush of an old cathedral. Rick sat on a broken railing, staring into the dim light that pooled at the edge of a ruined plaza. And for a moment, he felt younger than he had in years. The strange light was flickering, faint and unsteady, but there was a warmth in it that didn't belong to science or invention. It wasn't a portal, or an energy core, or some malfunctioning gadget he'd left behind. It was more like the glow of a candle that someone had forgotten to blow out. He didn't move toward it at first. He simply watched it from where he sat, the way you might watch a fire in the distance and wonder who else had gathered around it before you. The plaza smelled of stone dust and faint metal, remnants of machines abandoned long ago. Overhead, the sky shifted between bruised colors, purples, faint greens, and a blue so thin it could break if you stared too hard. Rick lifted the flask to his lips, but even that old ritual felt different tonight. The drink wasn't a shield against feeling, not here. Tonight it was just another sound in the quiet. A soft swallow, a sigh that faded into the open air. He remembered something then, though he couldn't have said why. A memory from when he was small, maybe 7, maybe 8. He had been alone in a workshop that smelled of solder and warm plastic, and on the table sat a toy he had built from scraps. It didn't work, not really, but it glowed faintly in the dark. He had stared at it the way he stared now at this flickering light. Back then, he'd thought the glow meant the toy was alive, that it might even be listening to him if he whispered. He had whispered too, telling it that he was lonely. The thought made him shift, pressing his palms together as if to keep the memory from spilling further. He glanced over his shoulder. Morty had fallen asleep not far from him, curled awkwardly on a patch of ground that looked softer than it was. Rick studied the boy's chest rising and falling, the occasional twitch of a dream moving through him. Morty looked peaceful in a way Rick couldn't remember feeling himself. The sight pulled at him, gentle and unrelenting. The light flickered again, and something stirred in Rick's chest. Not urgency, but recognition. It was as if the universe had left a message here, waiting only for the night when he would finally slow down enough to notice it. The plaza wasn't haunted, not in the frightening sense, but it was full of presence. Every broken wall, every crack in the stone seemed to lean closer, listening to the light. Rick thought about walking away. He thought about dismissing it as nonsense, a trick of Dimension 35C's unstable physics. But there was no bite in his cynicism tonight. Instead, he let himself linger. His mind moved slowly, like someone walking through water, touching old memories one at a time. He thought of lullabies he once hummed under his breath without meaning to. He thought of sandwiches eaten on long afternoons, of clouds he used to study until they drifted out of reach. He thought of people who had left and people he had left behind. He hadn't planned to feel any of this. He hadn't planned to feel anything at all. But the strange thing about silence was that it gave feelings room to echo. They expanded quietly until even a man who ran from his own heart had to sit and listen. Rick rubbed his face with both hands, letting his fingers drag down across his jaw. The light wasn't brighter now, but it was steadier. He wondered if Morty, waking later, would see it the same way. Would the boy feel the memory of childhood toys in its glow? Or would he simply see what was in front of him, a flickering remnant of an unremarkable dimension? Rick almost hoped Morty would see nothing at all. There was tenderness in being the only one who remembered. The night stretched on. The silence folded itself into new shapes, sometimes heavy, sometimes soft. Rick's eyes grew tired, but he resisted sleep. There was too much to notice, too much to quietly endure. He leaned back against the railing, the metal cold against his spine, and whispered words he didn't mean anyone to hear. They weren't equations or curses, just fragments of old sentences. Apologies, maybe. Promises he had never spoken. He doubted the light understood him, but it flickered at the sound, as though nodding in rhythm with his confession. It would have been easy to laugh at himself, but he didn't. He let the moment be what it was, strange, fragile, unscientific. He let the hush of Dimension 35C cradle him the way the memory of a blanket had once cradled him in the dark of his childhood room. When his eyes finally closed, he saw the glow not as a light at all, but as a small figure waiting patiently in the distance, humming to itself in a voice too faint to name. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. Some presences are strongest when they remain unnamed. Somewhere in the drifting space between sleep and thought, Rick realized that not everything in the infinite had to be solved. Some things were meant to be carried quietly, like an ember cupped in both hands. And with that, the plaza seemed to exhale, and the night folded deeper into itself, waiting for morning. When Rick was a boy, the world seemed too big for him, and yet he carried it in his pocket like a marble. He didn't always understand why his mind reached where other minds stopped, why machines seemed to lean toward him as though eager to be built. But even then, before the bitterness, before the walls he later built around his heart, there was a softness to him. He didn't invent to dominate or to prove himself right. He invented to feel less alone. On nights when the stars were clear, he would gather scraps from forgotten garages and corners of the house, screws and wires and pieces of discarded toys. His small fingers worked clumsily but patiently. He would build contraptions that whirred for a few seconds, glowing faintly, sometimes spinning a single gear before falling silent. His parents didn't notice most of these experiments. They saw a boy hunched over a table, talking to himself, and thought he was simply distracted. But Rick was never just distracted. He was listening. Listening to the secret way the world spoke in sparks and hums. There was one toy in particular he made that stayed with him longer than the rest. It was no larger than a sandwich box, a little cube of wood wrapped in copper wire with a button on top that didn't always respond. When it did, the cube gave off a low hum, almost like a lullaby without words. Rick carried it with him everywhere for a time. At school, where other children teased him for daydreaming, he would press the button beneath his desk and let the hum steady his heart. At night, when loneliness crept in like a draft through the walls, he would rest his head against it until he drifted into sleep. The cube didn't survive the years. It broke apart, like so many things did. But the memory of it returned now in the quiet of Dimension 35C, as if the flickering light in the plaza had whispered its name back into Rick's heart. He thought about the boy he once was, sitting on the floor with screws scattered around him like little silver stars. That boy didn't dream of galaxies or conquest. He dreamed of companionship, of something that would hum him into safety. Morty stirred nearby in his restless sleep, and Rick found himself watching again. The boy reminded him of those earlier years, awkward, uncertain, always reaching for understanding but rarely finding it. Rick knew Morty would never build machines the way he had. But Morty carried another kind of gift, quieter and perhaps harder to notice. Where Rick had once made little boxes to soothe himself, Morty soothed others simply by staying near. His patience, his willingness to follow, his nervous but loyal heart. These were the inventions Morty brought into the world. Rick sighed, the sound soft, almost affectionate. He hadn't meant to think of his childhood tonight. He rarely let those memories through. But Dimension 35C had a way of loosening the knots he tied inside himself. He tilted his head back against the railing again and let the thoughts wander where they wanted. He remembered the old shed in his backyard where dust motes floated like planets in sunlight. He remembered how time slowed there, how afternoons could stretch into forever. That was the place he first realized that silence wasn't empty. It was full of waiting, full of potential. He had whispered to the silence as though it were a friend, and somehow it had always whispered back. Years later, He would call it science. He would name the formulas, sketch the equations, sharpen his mind until it was a blade. But in those first days, it had been nothing more complicated than wonder. And wonder was a softer language, one that didn't cut, one that cradled instead. Rick reached for the flask again, paused, and lowered it without drinking. For once he didn't need the numbness. The silence was enough. The memory of the boy with the humming cube was enough. He let his eyes close and he almost smiled. Almost. The plaza shifted subtly, the dimension's atmosphere bending in slow currents. A faint wind carried with it scents Rick couldn't name. Part stone, part metal, part something sweeter, like bread baking far away. The smell tugged another memory loose. He saw himself in the kitchen of his childhood home, eating a sandwich he had made alone because no one else was hungry. The bread was uneven, the cheese too thick, but the act of making it had been a kind of victory. He had sat at the table humming softly to himself, and the hum had echoed against the window glass until it seemed like the house was singing with him. The sandwich, the cube, the whispers in silence. These were not stories he had ever told anyone. They were small, too small to matter to anyone else. And yet, here in the twilight hush of Dimension 35C, they returned to him with the weight of truth. They explained parts of him he had long left unexplained. They showed him that his life hadn't always been a chase across galaxies, or a litany of regrets. Once he had been a child with the sky in his eyes, building fragile machines to keep himself company. Morty turned in his sleep, muttering something too soft to catch. Rick leaned forward slightly, listening, but the words faded into the night. It didn't matter. The boy's voice, even in dreams, carried the same unspoken loyalty. Rick let the sound settle in his chest like another hum, another makeshift lullaby. The stars above flickered in uneven constellations, patterns no one had named. Rick gazed at them until they blurred, until his mind softened with the rhythm of their quiet shimmer. He didn't need them to explain themselves. Not everything had to be named or charted. Some things could simply exist, like the memory of a toy that once hummed him to sleep. And so he sat in the plaza, between memory and dream, between the child he had been and the old man he had become. The silence grew thick again, but it was not heavy. It was gentle. It was patient. And in that patience, Rick felt, for a moment, the strange comfort of being seen. Not by another person, not by Morty, not even by the universe itself, but by the part of himself that had always been waiting, the part that still carried the cube, still pressed the button, still believed that light could be a kind of friend. The night deepened, the air cooled, and though Rick did not fall asleep, his heart drifted closer to rest than it had in a very long time. There had once been a man in Rick's life who listened more than he spoke. Not a father in the way people mean the word, not quite a teacher either. He was older, grey in the beard and soft in the eyes, and Rick remembered him as clearly as he remembered the sound of his own inventions humming late at night. The man had no laboratory, no machines that bent the rules of the universe. What he had was time, long unhurried time, and an ear that treated every word Rick spoke as if it were worth keeping. When Rick was still young, still untested by the edges of grief, he would wander into this man's porch at twilight. The boards creaked beneath his shoes and the smell of tobacco hung in the wood. The man never asked why Rick had come. He would simply point to the empty chair beside him and tilt his head toward the sky. And there, as evening slipped toward night, Rick learned how to listen. The sky, the man said, had voices too quiet for most people to hear. Not the explosions of suns, not the violence of collapsing stars. No, the sky spoke in smaller tones. The hush of a drifting cloud, the subtle tremor when the air cooled, the faint ringing in your ears when the world was still enough. Rick had laughed at first, certain it was nonsense. But when he closed his eyes and let silence settle over him, he found himself believing. He could almost hear it. The low, endless murmur of stars telling their slow, patient stories. The memory pressed against him now in dimension 35C. He sat with Morty still sleeping nearby, and he thought of that porch, that voice, those evenings when the world felt too wide but somehow safe within its wideness. He realized with a quiet ache that he had never told Morty about the man. He had never spoken of how it felt to be small and yet held, not by hands, but by the sheer patience of another soul. Rick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He glanced at Morty again. The boy had shifted onto his side, one hand curled near his face. There was innocence in the posture, a kind of unspoken trust. Rick swallowed. It struck him that he was now the age the old man had been, maybe older. The cycle had turned without his noticing.
He was the listener now, or at least he could be, if only he would allow himself, he whispered, testing the thought.
You gotta listen, Morty, even when there's nothing to hear. The words disappeared into the plaza, but they hung around him like the smoke that used to curl through the porch light. He wondered if Morty, in his dreaming state, had caught even the edge of them. Perhaps not, but perhaps he didn't need to. Words, after all, were not the only way of hearing. Rick let his eyes rise to the sky. Dimension 35C stars looked crooked, as if stitched together by someone who had forgotten the pattern. They pulsed faintly, irregularly, and yet there was beauty in the imperfection. He remembered the old man saying once that not all music rhymes and not all stars keep steady rhythm. Rick had rolled his eyes then, but now he found the thought oddly comforting. The flask was in his hand again, but he didn't drink. He turned it slowly, watching the metal catch the dim light, and thought about how little the old man had ever needed. A chair, a porch, the stretch of sky.
That had been enough.
And yet it had stayed with Rick, more enduring than equations, more haunting than mistakes. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of gratitude, though he had never said the word aloud. Gratitude had always been a language he stumbled over. But here, tonight, in this broken plaza, it came naturally, like breathing. The silence stretched. Morty sighed in his sleep. A faint wind carried a whisper through the empty arches around them, and Rick almost thought he heard the old man's voice. Not words, not anything he could repeat, but the familiar cadence of presence. He leaned into it, letting his chest loosen. For a brief moment, he wasn't the genius who had outrun universes. He was just a boy again, sitting on a porch with someone who believed that silence was worth listening to. He thought then of legacy. Not the kind that comes with inventions or discoveries, not the kind carved into history. He thought of the legacy of listening, of how one patient man had given him something that still lived inside him decades later. He wondered if he could pass the same gift to Morty. He wondered if, someday, Morty would remember not the adventures, not the chaos, but the nights when Rick simply sat beside him and let silence speak. The stars above shimmered, crooked and incomplete. Rick tilted his head back and whispered, "I hear you." He didn't know if he was speaking to the sky, to the memory of the old man, or to Morty asleep at his side. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe listening was always a form of answering. For a long time, he remained like that, his body weary, but his mind strangely at ease. The plaza felt softer, less abandoned. Even the flickering light seemed calmer, as though it too had been listening. Rick thought about the porch one last time, about the way the old man had never tried to explain him, never tried to fix him. He had only sat and waited and believed that a boy's words were worth hearing. That was enough. Rick exhaled slowly, deeply, a sound that was half sigh, half lullaby. His eyes closed, and though he did not sleep, he drifted into a stillness close enough to rest. The memory folded into him gently, like a blanket laid across tired shoulders, and as the night deepened, he let himself be carried by the quiet voices of the stars, voices he no longer tried to name. Morning in Dimensions 35C did not arrive like morning in other places. There was no sun that rose neatly over a horizon, no golden light spilling predictably through windows. Instead, the sky lightened in fragments, as though pieces of color were stitched into the fabric of darkness one by one. A pale stripe of pink here, a slow fade of gray there, until the night loosened its grip. Rick watched the changes with a strange quietness, feeling both inside and outside of time. Morty was already stirring, his hair a tangled mess, his eyes puffy from restless dreaming. He rubbed his face, groaned, and looked at Rick with that mixture of trust and confusion that always seemed to live in him. "You didn't sleep, did you?" he mumbled. Rick didn't answer. Instead, he handed Morty half of a sandwich he had pulled from a crumpled bag. It wasn't fresh, the bread dry at the edges, but Morty accepted it gratefully. They ate together in silence, the sound of chewing strangely comforting. It reminded Rick of old afternoons when he was younger, when the act of eating something simple felt like proof that he was still part of the world. Food had always been more than sustenance. It was ritual. It was a quiet way of saying, "I'm here with you." He wondered if Morty understood that without being told. He suspected he did. Afterward, they sat side by side, gazing at the broken plaza. The light from the night before had gone, leaving only memory behind. Rick almost mentioned it, almost told Morty what it had felt like to see it, but the words stayed folded inside him. Some experiences were meant to remain unspoken, shared only with silence.
Instead, he pointed toward the shifting clouds above them.
They moved slowly, bending into odd shapes that refused to hold still. "Looks like a duck," Morty said after a long pause, squinting at one of the drifting forms. Rick tilted his head. To him, it looked more like a chair. Another cloud followed, thin and stretched like a ribbon. Rick thought it resembled a long road, but Morty insisted it looked like string. The back and forth carried no weight, no argument. It was simply the comfort of seeing something together, even if differently. As the sky continued its quiet dance, Rick felt a rare ease fill him. He remembered afternoons from his boyhood when he had lain on the grass, sandwich crumbs on his shirt, staring at clouds as though they were untranslatable messages. He used to imagine they were trying to tell him something that if he could just watch long enough, he might understand. Back then, he hadn't needed the clouds to make sense. He had only needed them to keep him company. The memory folded into the present moment, and Rick realized that perhaps nothing had really changed. Here he was again, older now, with Morty beside him, still staring at shapes in the sky, still waiting for messages that might never come. And yet, there was comfort in the waiting itself. Morty leaned back, hands tucked beneath his head.
"Do you think they ever, mean anything?"
he asked softly, his voice nearly swallowed by the morning air. Rick almost answered with sarcasm, almost brushed it off as childish. But instead, he let the question linger. He thought of the old man on the porch, of the cube that hummed, of the sandwich eaten in solitude, of the flickering light from the night before. Then he said, quietly, "Sometimes meaning isn't the point. Sometimes it's just about noticing." Morty nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the clouds. The boy didn't always understand Rick's words, but he understood the tone, the undercurrent.
That was enough. The day moved lazily.
They walked the edges of the plaza, stepping over cracks in the stone, pausing to pick up fragments of old machinery that no longer functioned. Morty carried one piece with him, a gear no larger than his palm. He turned it over and over, as if the act of holding it connected him to the countless unknown stories it once belonged to. Rick watched him but didn't interrupt. He remembered being that boy, holding broken things and giving them weight just by paying attention. When the light began to fade again, they sat together on a fallen column. The air cooled, carrying with it the faint scent of something sweet, like fruit ripening in the distance. Rick thought of summers long past, of small kindnesses shared over food, of people who had sat beside him without demanding explanations. He turned toward Morty and said, almost gently, "You know, not everything worth keeping has to be fixed." Morty blinked, then looked down at the gear in his hand. He nodded slowly, clutching it a little tighter. Rick didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The clouds shifted once more, now darker with the return of night. A silence settled over them, not heavy but companionable. They stayed that way, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in rhythm with the sky. Rick thought of how many years he had spent filling silences with noise, afraid of what he might hear if he let them stretch too long. But tonight, he didn't feel afraid. Tonight, silence felt like an old friend. When Morty finally spoke again, his words were quiet, almost shy.
"It's nice, just
Sitting here." Rick gave a short nod, his throat tight with something he didn't want to name. He glanced at the boy, then back at the clouds, and let himself believe, for just a moment, that maybe this was enough. The plaza dimmed. The stars returned, uneven and crooked, flickering with the same patient rhythm as before. Rick leaned back against the stone and closed his eyes, letting the memory of sandwiches, clouds, and small discoveries carry him gently into stillness. There was a door in Rick's childhood home that never opened. It wasn't locked, at least not in the way most doors are, with bolts and keys. It was locked in a quieter way, with silence and avoidance. It stood at the end of a narrow hallway, paint chipped, hinges rusted, the kind of door people walk past without noticing. But Rick had noticed. He had noticed every day. As a boy, he would pause in front of it, his small hand hovering near the handle, wondering what lay behind it. Sometimes he thought it was a storage closet, forgotten and filled with old shoes. Other times, he imagined it was a secret room, a place that belonged only to him, where he might sit in peace and hear the world in a softer tone. He never knew for certain.
no one explained."
No one ever said, "That door is nothing," or "That door is everything." They simply passed by, pretending it wasn't there. And so the mystery grew. It was not a loud kind of mystery, not something urgent or dramatic. It was the kind of mystery that lived inside him like a whisper. He learned to carry it with him, to weave it into his inventions and his daydreams. In some ways, it shaped him more than anything that was ever explained. Now in dimension 35C, the memory of that door returned with surprising clarity. The cracked stones of the plaza almost resembled the hallway floor. The dim corners of the ruins carried the same weight of the unknown. Rick sat with Morty nearby, watching the crooked stars, and thought about how much of his life had been spent standing in front of closed doors. Morty shifted on the ground, restless. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. His voice was groggy, curious, but not pressing. Rick considered brushing the question aside, but instead he said, "Doors." Morty frowned, glancing at the broken archways around them.
"Like these?"
Rick shook his head.
"Like the ones you never open?"
"The ones that stay closed and you don't even know why." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Morty, in his way, understood more than Rick often admitted. The boy nodded slowly, letting the thought sink in. Rick remembered standing before that childhood door, heart beating faster than it should have, wishing for someone to stand beside him and wonder too.
No one ever did.
It was always just him, alone with the unanswered question. In time, he had stopped trying the handle. He had learned to live with the not knowing. But even now, decades later, the memories still pulsed inside him like a quiet lantern. He wondered what it meant to live with mysteries like that. Not the grand mysteries of the universe, not equations or galaxies, but the small mysteries. A door left unopened, a word left unsaid, a goodbye never spoken. Perhaps those were the mysteries that shaped people most. The ones too ordinary for anyone else to notice, but too heavy for the heart to forget. Morty picked up a stone and turned it in his hand, staring at its uneven surface. "Did you ever?"
Find out? He asked.
Rick gave a short laugh, dry but not cruel. "No, Morty, some doors stay shut forever." He expected the answer to sound bitter, but it didn't. Instead, it carried a kind of calm, the peace of finally accepting that not all questions had answers. The night deepened around them. A faint wind pressed through the ruins, and Rick closed his eyes. He pictured the hallway again, the chipped paint, the rusted hinges. He pictured his small hand on the handle, and he imagined, just for a moment, what it would have felt like to open it. Would he have found nothing but dust, or would he have found something that changed him forever?
He would never know.
And maybe that was the point. He turned to look at Morty, who was now lying back, gazing at the sky with wide, unblinking eyes.
"Yeah, you'll have doors like that too," Rick said softly.
Morty glanced at him, uncertain. "Things you'll never get to open."
"That's life." Morty frowned, but he didn't argue.
He let the words settle, and after a while he whispered, "I guess it's okay, as long as you don't forget they're there." Rick felt a tightness in his chest at that. The boy was right, though he hadn't meant to be profound. Remembering the door mattered as much as opening it ever could. The mystery itself was a kind of inheritance, a thread woven into who you became. They sat together in that understanding, letting silence fill the spaces words could not. The plaza seemed to lean closer, as if the ruins themselves were listening. Rick thought about how many times he had run from silence, filling it with machines, noise, and movement. But here, tonight, silence felt like the most honest companion he had. The flickering light from nights past did not return. Instead, there was only the crooked shimmer of stars, uneven but steady in their own way. Rick watched them and thought of doors, of mysteries, of the strange comfort of never knowing everything. When sleep finally began to pull at him, he did not resist. His last thought was not of inventions or failures, but of a boy standing in a hallway, his hand resting on a handle he would never turn. That boy was still inside him, still waiting, still wondering. And maybe, Rick thought, that was enough. Morty was never built for grand gestures. He wasn't the kind of boy who rushed into danger without thought, or who carved his name into history with blazing acts of courage. His bravery lived in quieter places. Rick had noticed it long before Morty noticed it himself. It appeared in the way the boy stayed, even when he was afraid. It showed in the way he listened, even when he didn't understand. Courage, Rick realized, could be as small as refusing to walk away. One evening in Dimension 35C, that truth revealed itself again. The air was colder than usual, and a fog had begun to creep between the ruins, rolling across the plaza like a patient tide. Morty shivered but did not complain. He walked close beside Rick, eyes darting into the mist, but his footsteps never faltered. Rick glanced at him, noting the tightness in his jaw, the way his hand twitched at his side.
Fear was there, plain as day.
But so was resolve. Rick remembered his own younger years, when fear had meant retreat, when unanswered questions had driven him deeper into himself. Morty was different. Morty carried his fear openly, yet still moved forward. That was a lesson Rick found harder to admit. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk with it. They found a broken column where the fog pooled around its base, and Rick motioned for them to sit. Morty lowered himself onto the stone, hugging his knees. For a while neither spoke. The world felt muted, as though sound itself had been swallowed by the mist. Rick thought of the old
man on the porch again, of the silence he had taught Rick to honor.
And in that silence, he began to see Morty differently. "Scared?" Rick asked finally, his voice more gentle than he intended. Morty hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but..."
"I don't know. I'm used to it." Rick studied him, seeing not weakness but endurance.
To be used to fear and still keep going, wasn't that strength? He almost told Morty so, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he looked away, letting the quiet stretch. The boy shifted, pulling something from his pocket. It was the broken gear he had carried since the day before. He turned it slowly in his fingers, letting the dim light catch its edges.
I don't even know why I keep this, Morty admitted.
It doesn't do anything. Rick watched the small movement of his hands. Not everything's about doing, he said. Morty looked at him, puzzled, but Rick didn't explain further. The boy would understand in time.
Or maybe he already did. The fog thickened, curling like smoke, and Rick felt the weight of memory press on him.
He saw Morty as he had been when they first began traveling together, nervous, stumbling, too quick to doubt himself. But here now Morty was steady.
Older in spirit than his years, though he didn't realize it.
Rick saw how the boy had grown, not through battles or victories, but through persistence. Morty had stayed. Morty had learned how to endure. Rick leaned back against the column, letting his eyes close. "You ever think," he murmured, "that maybe being brave isn't about what you do, but about how you sit with yourself when you're scared?" Morty blinked, his brow furrowed.
I guess. I never thought about it like that. Rick let the moment hang.
He didn't push the lesson, didn't drive it home. He let it seep, slow and quiet, the way truths often needed to. Above them the stars wavered behind the fog, their crooked patterns softened into blurred halos. Morty leaned his head back to look, and Rick noticed the boy's breathing had steadied. Fear was still there. Rick could see it in the twitch of his shoulders. But Morty had learned how to hold it without breaking. That was its own kind of victory. The night deepened. Rick reached for his flask, paused, and set it down again. He didn't need it. Morty's presence was grounding enough. Strange, he thought, how the boy had become his anchor, without either of them meaning for it to happen. Strange how Morty's quiet courage softened the edges of his own restless mind. They sat until the fog began to thin, the stars slowly sharpening back into focus. Morty yawned, leaning against the column, his head drooping slightly toward Rick's shoulder. Rick stayed still, allowing it. He felt the weight of the boy there, fragile but steady, and for once he didn't move away. He let the closeness remain, a silent acknowledgement of all the unspoken courage Morty carried. Rick thought of doors that never opened, of toys that once hummed, of clouds shifting without meaning, and he realized that Morty was another mystery he didn't need to solve. He didn't need to measure the boy's courage, or define it, or prove it. He only needed to notice it, to honor it quietly. When Morty finally drifted into sleep, Rick whispered words the boy would never hear. "You're braver than you think, Morty." His voice broke slightly, softened by the fog. "Braver than me." The stars overhead pulsed unevenly as if nodding in agreement. The plaza exhaled, and Rick closed his eyes, letting the stillness of Dimension 35C wrap around him. He didn't sleep, but he rested. And in that rest, he carried the image of Morty's quiet courage, a light steadier than any invention could ever create. The morning in Dimension 35C arrived without sunlight. It was not a sunrise in the way Morty had known back home, with golden warmth and the promise of a new day. Instead, it was a slow lifting of the mist, a thinning of shadows that revealed the ruins in soft, grey detail. The world here never felt fully awake, as though it preferred to linger between dreaming and remembering.
Rick liked that.
Morty wasn't sure, but he followed anyway. They walked among broken arches, their steps echoing faintly. Morty noticed how Rick's hands stayed tucked into his coat, as though holding himself together against the emptiness. He wanted to ask if Rick was cold, but he didn't. Instead, he watched the way Rick's eyes scanned everything. Not with urgency, but with a quiet hunger, as though he was searching for something he could not name. Rick paused, at an overgrown fountain. Vines spilled from its cracked basin, and a trickle of water still glistened in its center, catching what little light there was. He stood there for a long while. Morty shuffled beside him, hesitant, then asked, "What do you see?" Rick didn't answer right away. He crouched, running his hand along the mossy stone. "Once," he said finally, "things like this mattered to someone.
Somebody built this, tended it, made sure the water kept flowing. And now..."
He let the sentence fade, his hand pulling back. Morty looked at the fountain differently then. Not as a ruin, but as a memory made visible. They sat at the fountain's edge, listening to the faint drip of water. Morty dipped his fingers into the pool, tracing small circles. "Do you ever think about who was here before us?" he asked. Rick gave a small grunt, but it wasn't dismissive. "All the time," he said softly. "Places remember, Morty, even if people don't." Morty tilted his head, as though trying to hear what the place was remembering. He couldn't, not really. But he imagined children running through the plaza, laughter echoing between walls that now crumbled in silence. He imagined voices speaking a language long forgotten, footsteps carrying stories no one alive could recall. The thought made his chest ache in a way he didn't fully understand. Rick lit a small device, no bigger than a lighter, and held it toward the fountain. A faint hum filled the air, and for an instant Morty swore he saw shapes. Flickers of light resembling people, standing where the fountain once flowed freely. It lasted only a moment before fading into mist. Rick slipped the device back into his coat without comment. Morty blinked, startled. "Was that real?" Rick smirked faintly. "Does it matter?" Morty frowned, but said nothing more. He let the image linger in his mind, shadowy figures leaning close, speaking softly, existing in a time he would never touch. It wasn't real in any practical way, but it was real in feeling.
That was enough. The day stretched onward, quiet and slow.
They wandered through more fragments of stone, pausing often without reason. Rick seemed less interested in moving forward than in noticing small things, the way vines clung to the walls, the way dust swirled when the wind passed through, the way old carvings still clung stubbornly to life on broken surfaces. Morty followed, learning to see through Rick's eyes, learning that paying attention could feel like a kind of reverence. At one point, Morty found a shard of pottery half buried in the dirt. He brushed it off and held it up. The piece was painted with a faded pattern of stars. "Look," he said. Rick glanced at it and nodded, taking it briefly in his hand. His thumb traced the fading design.
"Somebody painted this," he murmured.
"Took time, steady hands, care. And now it's just lying here, waiting for someone to notice." Morty waited for Rick to pocket it, but instead, Rick set it carefully back where it had been, resting it gently in the earth. "Why not keep it?" Morty asked. Rick shrugged. "Not everything needs to be taken. Some things belong to the silence." Morty thought about that as they walked on. He realized how often he wanted to hold on to things, souvenirs, moments, proof. But maybe there was a kind of respect in leaving things where they were, in letting them continue their quiet existence without interference. As dusk crept in, they returned to the plaza. The fog was lighter tonight, and the crooked stars shone more clearly, tilting in their uneven constellations. Morty lay on the ground, staring up, and said, "Do you think they see us? The people who used to be here?" Rick lowered himself beside him, stretching out with a slow sigh. "Maybe. Or maybe we're just imagining them so hard they almost feel real." Morty nodded sleepily. "Either way, it's kind of nice." Rick chuckled under his breath, a sound closer to warmth than Morty was used to. "Yeah, it is." The stars flickered, uneven but steady, and the plaza held them gently, as though it understood the weight of their presence. Rick closed his eyes, letting the day slip into memory, and Morty followed, drifting towards sleep with the sound of the fountain's faint drip still echoing in his ears. There was a tree that grew at the far edge of the ruins, Unlike the others, it had not withered into splinters or crumbled into barkless limbs. It stood alone, tall and bending slightly, with leaves the color of ash. Rick and Morty found it one afternoon while following a path that led nowhere, their footsteps crunching softly over broken stone. Morty was the first to notice it. He pointed, squinting.
It looks alive, he said with surprise.
Rick tilted his head, studying the strange silhouette. Alive enough, he replied, his voice quiet, as though wary of breaking the tree's stillness. They approached together, neither rushing, as if drawn by something older than curiosity. Up close, the tree's trunk was wide and twisted, its bark marked with deep grooves that seemed almost like writing. Morty ran his hand along one of the ridges.
Feels like scars, he whispered.
Rick nodded but said nothing, his gaze tracing upward to the branches. They spread wide, their shapes uneven, reaching in all directions as though the tree were trying to touch every piece of sky it could. Beneath it, the ground was soft with fallen leaves, pale and delicate. Morty picked one up and
held it to the light.
It looked fragile, almost translucent, as if it might crumble between his fingers. But it didn't. It stayed whole, humming faintly with a kind of quiet resilience. Morty smiled to himself and slipped it into his pocket. Rick lowered himself to the base of the trunk, sitting with his back against the bark. For once, he looked comfortable, as though the tree had been waiting for him. Morty hesitated, then sat beside him. The air here felt different, calmer, heavier with memory. Rick broke the silence first. When I was a kid, he said, I used to think trees were older than time, like they remembered things no one else could. His voice softened, almost lost in the sound of rustling branches. Maybe I wasn't wrong. Morty tilted his head back, staring up into the grey leaves.
Do you think this one remembers?
Rick smirked faintly. If it does, it probably knows more than either of us ever will. They let the thought linger. The branches swayed gently above, and the sound was like whispers. Not urgent, not clear, just fragments of a language too old to be understood. Morty closed his eyes and listened, letting the rhythm settle in his chest. He thought of all the times he had hidden under trees back home, during storms, during long afternoons when he wanted to be alone, during moments he couldn't explain to anyone else. Trees had always felt like guardians, patient and steady. And now, in this strange world, that feeling returned, stronger than ever. Rick tapped the bark behind him with his fingers. You know, Morty, he murmured, sometimes it's not about building something new. Sometimes it's about finding what survived. Morty opened his eyes and looked at him. Rick's expression was unreadable, but his hand rested gently on the tree, as though he was speaking to it more than to Morty. The boy nodded, even if he didn't fully grasp the meaning. He sensed it was one of those truths that would settle slowly, taking root like the tree itself. The afternoon passed without measure. Time in dimension Tiabi, 35C, never seemed to move the way it did elsewhere. Shadows lengthened, the air cooled, and yet they stayed, unwilling to leave the comfort of the tree's quiet presence. At one point, Morty lay on the ground, staring up through the branches. The crooked stars were just beginning to show in the sky, their uneven light filtering through the leaves.
It feels safe here, he whispered.
Rick glanced at him, then back at the tree.
Yeah, he said softly.
It does? For a while, Rick dozed lightly, head tilted back, breathing steady. Morty stayed awake, listening to the sounds around him. The wind through the branches, the faint rustle of leaves falling, the steady rhythm of Rick's quiet snores. It felt almost like home, though he couldn't explain why. When Rick stirred awake, the stars were brighter. He looked up at them through the canopy and murmured, You ever notice, Morty, how some things keep standing even when everything else falls apart? Morty thought about that, his fingers brushing the leaf in his pocket. Yeah? He said after a long pause. Maybe that's what makes them special. Rick gave a small, tired smile. Maybe that's what makes them necessary. They stayed until the chill of night began to press against their skin. Finally, Rick pushed himself up, brushing leaves from his coat. Morty rose too, reluctant to leave, but knowing they couldn't stay forever. They took one last look at the tree, its branches stretching endlessly, its roots hidden deep below. As they walked away, Morty glanced back. For a moment, he imagined the tree watching them, holding their presence in its memory, adding them to all the lives it had already witnessed. The thought comforted him in a way he couldn't put into words. Rick noticed the glance but said nothing. He understood. Some things didn't need to be spoken. Some things were meant to be carried quietly, like a leaf in a pocket, like a tree standing alone at the edge of ruins. The path back to the plaza felt lighter. The stars tilted above, uneven and gentle, and the night air carried the faintest echo of the trees' whispers. Rick and Morty walked side by side, not in silence exactly, but in the kind of quiet that held meaning. And somewhere, behind them, the tree stood tall, remembering for them both. The nights in Dimension 35C had a way of folding in on themselves. They did not arrive suddenly, nor did they fade cleanly into morning. Instead, they lingered, curling like smoke, stretching out until Rick and Morty sometimes forgot how long they had been walking, or sitting, or simply breathing in the stillness. This night was no different. The plaza seemed to glow faintly, though no fire burned, no lamp flickered. It was as if the stones themselves remembered light. Rick sat with his back against a fallen wall, Morty lying nearby, both wrapped in the gentle hush. The boy's breathing had slowed into something like half-sleep, his eyes drifting open and shut, as though caught between dream and waking. Rick, though, remained alert. He watched the uneven stars above, their crooked shimmer shifting ever so slightly with the night air. Morty stirred suddenly, turning toward him. "Do you ever feel like we're supposed to be here?" he asked. His voice was groggy, fragile, but steady. Rick tilted his head, considering. "Supposed to?" "No, but we are here."
"That's enough." Morty frowned softly, pulling his jacket tighter. "I mean, like it's not an accident." Rick smirked, though it carried no sharpness.
"Maybe everything feels like an accident until you decide it isn't." He looked away as soon as the words left his mouth, unsettled by how true they sounded. For a while, Morty said nothing. He rolled onto his back again, staring at the sky. Rick followed his gaze, though his mind wandered elsewhere. Back to that boy in the hallway, back to the unopened door, back to the tree they had left behind. Each memory wove into the present like threads in a fabric too old to unravel. The silence stretched until Morty's voice returned, quieter this time. "Do you think we'll be remembered?"
"Like the tree remembers."
"Or the fountain?" Rick hesitated. He wanted to say no. He wanted to point out that most people faded, that memory was fragile, that nothing lasted. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he sighed. "If we are, Morty, it won't be for the things we think. People get remembered for little things. A laugh? A mistake? A quiet moment that mattered to someone else more than it mattered to you." Morty nodded, eyes still locked on the crooked stars.
"I think I'd like that," he whispered. Rick watched him for a long time, a heaviness pressing at his chest.
He thought of how often he had run from the idea of being remembered, of how the very thought made him feel both exposed and unworthy. But here, with Morty's simple honesty, the idea softened. Maybe being remembered didn't have to be about greatness. Maybe it could just mean leaving behind the warmth of a single moment. The ruins creaked faintly in the wind, and Rick reached into his pocket, pulling out a small fragment of metal. It was bent, almost useless, a remnant of some device long broken. He turned it over in his hand, then set it down gently on the stone beside him.
"There," he muttered.
"Something to leave behind." Morty pushed himself up slightly, blinking at the fragment. "Why?" Rick shrugged. "So the place remembers us too." Morty stared at it, then smiled faintly. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the pale leaf from the tree. He placed it next to Rick's fragment side by side. "Now it'll remember both of us." Rick swallowed hard, looking away. The boy didn't understand how much that small act meant, or maybe he did. Either way, Rick felt the gesture settle deep inside him, quiet and steady. They lay back again, side by side, the fragment and the leaf resting where the plaza could hold them. The stars above shifted slowly, tilting in their uneven constellations. After a long while, Morty whispered, "Do you think stars remember too?" Rick chuckled softly, eyes closing. "If they do, Morty, they're probably tired of it by now." But as he drifted into the edge of sleep, Rick thought about the question more seriously. Maybe stars did remember, not in names or stories, but in light. Maybe every crooked shimmer overhead was a kind of memory, reaching across the dark, insisting that something once existed and still did, in some form. Morty's breathing deepened beside him, slow and even, and Rick felt the night finally pull at him. His last thought before slipping under was not of doors or inventions, not even of regrets. It was of a fragment of metal and a fragile leaf, resting side by side on ancient stone, two small tokens saying quietly, "We were here." The morning after they left the fragment and the leaf behind, the air in Dimension 35C felt almost lighter. Rick didn't say it aloud, but something about leaving those small tokens had eased him. It was as though the ruins had accepted them, folded them into its long memory. Morty seemed to sense it too. His steps were slower, less restless, as if he had begun to move with the rhythm of the place rather than against it. They wandered without direction, letting the stones guide them. At one point, they found themselves before a collapsed tower. Its base was still standing, thick and immovable, but the rest lay scattered like bones across the earth. Morty climbed on to one of the fallen beams, balancing as he walked along it. His arms stretched out for steadiness, his laughter quiet but genuine. Rick watched, leaning against the tower's base, and for a moment he saw Morty not as a boy weighed down by fear, but as a child who still carried lightness inside him. When Morty hopped down, Rick said, almost absent-mindedly, "You remind me of someone?" Morty blinked.
"Who?" Rick didn't answer right away.
He picked up a loose stone, rolling it in his hand.
"Someone I
Used to know. Someone who could find balance even when the ground was broken. He tossed the stone aside, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter."
"They're gone." Morty didn't press.
He sat on the ground beside Rick, waiting. Rick felt the boy's quiet patience and let out a long breath. They taught me that not everything broken needs fixing.
"Some things just need to be lived with." His voice dropped. "I never listened." The silence after those words was heavy but not uncomfortable.
Morty leaned back, looking up at the half sky framed by ruins. "Maybe you remember them now because you're ready to listen," he said softly. Rick turned to study him, surprised by the simplicity of the response. Morty wasn't trying to be wise. He was just speaking what he felt. And yet, the truth of it sank into Rick like water into stone. The day moved on. They left the tower and followed a trail that led to a hillside. From the top, they could see the ruins stretching far, the crooked stars above them even in daylight, faint but present. Morty sat cross-legged at the peak, eyes wide at the view. "It's bigger than I thought," he whispered. Rick lowered himself beside him. Things usually are. They sat there for a long time, letting the expanse settle into them. Rick found himself remembering another hillside, one from his youth, when he had watched the world stretch wide and felt too small to matter. He realized he still carried that feeling, though he had buried it under science, machines, and noise. Now, with Morty sitting quietly at his side, he wondered if being small was not something to fear, but something to honor. Morty plucked a piece of grass from the hill and twirled it between his fingers.
"Do you ever wish you could stay somewhere like this forever?"
Rick smirked faintly.
"Forever's a long time, Morty." Yeah, but I don't know. It feels safe. Rick thought about that.
He thought about safety. How rarely he had known it, how fleeting it always seemed. Maybe it's not about staying, Morty, he said slowly. Maybe it's about knowing places like this exist. So when the world feels too heavy, you remember there's somewhere that held you gently once. Morty nodded, holding on to the grass. He didn't speak, but Rick could see the thought taking root in him. As evening settled, they descended back to the plaza. The fragment of metal and the leaf still rested where they had left them, untouched. Rick crouched, adjusting the leaf slightly so it wouldn't blow away. Morty smiled, seeing the care in the gesture. They sat together as night fell. The crooked stars brightened overhead, uneven but steady. Morty leaned his head on Rick's arm, eyes half closed. Rick stayed still, letting the contact remain. He thought of the friend he had lost, the one who had taught him about living with broken things. He thought of Morty, who was teaching him again in his own way. Rick exhaled slowly. "You know, Morty," he murmured, "maybe remembering is a kind of staying. Maybe that's enough." Morty didn't answer. His breathing had deepened, already slipping into sleep. Rick looked down at him, the weight of the boy against him, and felt something stir inside his chest. It wasn't regret this time. It was gentler. It was the faint comfort of knowing that even in a ruined world, even in Dimension 35C, there could still be quiet moments that lasted. The stars flickered unevenly above as if nodding their agreement. Rick closed his eyes, letting the night carry him closer to rest, and for once he didn't resist. The nights were beginning to blur together. Rick couldn't tell how many they had spent in Dimension 35C, and Morty had stopped asking. Time here was not measured by clocks or suns, but by the weight of silence, by the way the stars leaned overhead, by the rhythm of breathing shared between two travelers who had nowhere else to be. On this night, they sat near the fountain again. Its trickle of water was faint, but it had become a kind of heartbeat in the plaza, steady and familiar. Morty traced patterns in the dust with a stick, drawing crooked lines that reminded him of the stars. Rick watched him, the corners of his mouth twitching almost into a smile. There was something about the boy's persistence, his need to mark the earth even when it would all be washed away, that softened Rick more than he cared to admit. "Why do you always draw?" Rick asked finally. His tone wasn't mocking, just curious. Morty shrugged, without looking up.
I don't know. Feels like...
"If I leave something behind, then I was really here." Rick leaned back, staring at the sky. "You already are here, Morty." "Yeah, but..." Morty paused, dragging the stick a little harder. "If I don't make a mark, it's like nobody'll know. Like I'll disappear." Rick felt the words echo inside him, sharper than he expected. He thought of the friend he had lost, of the door never opened, of all the places where he had left no mark at all. "You won't disappear," he said gruffly, though the conviction wavered in his chest. Morty finally looked at him, eyes wide and honest. "How do you know?" Rick didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes, hearing the trickle of water, the faint rustle of vines. "Finally," he said, "because I'll remember." The boy blinked, startled by the softness in Rick's voice. For once, Morty didn't argue. He let the words sit between them like a fragile flame, small but steady. They stayed by the fountain until Morty's drawings blurred under the night air, the dust shifting back into shapelessness. Then they walked the plaza again, slow and aimless. Rick pointed out small details, a crack in the wall shaped like a crescent, a vine curling in the pattern of a spiral. Morty listened, realizing that even Rick's sharp eyes could still find wonder in ruins. When they returned to their resting place, Morty lay flat on his back, staring at the stars. "Do you think the people who built this place wanted to be remembered?" he asked. Rick settled beside him, folding his arms.
Everyone does. Even the ones who say they don't. Morty turned his head slightly.
"Do you?" Rick smirked, though it faltered almost immediately. "I used to think I didn't care." But maybe I just didn't want to admit how much I did." He sighed, the sound rough but tired. "Being remembered means being vulnerable, Morty. It means you mattered enough for someone to hold on to you." The boy thought about that, his brow furrowed.
"That doesn't sound bad." "No," Rick admitted quietly.
"It doesn't." The plaza settled into deeper silence, the kind that pressed gently but firmly, insisting on stillness. Rick closed his eyes, letting the thought wash over him. He realized how many nights of his life had been spent fighting silence, filling it with inventions, distractions, arguments. But here, now, the silence was teaching him to listen. Morty's breathing slowed beside him. Rick opened his eyes just enough to glance at the boy. He saw how Morty curled slightly on his side, the way children often do, as if instinctively protecting their heart, even in sleep. Rick felt a pang of tenderness, unexpected and sharp, and turned his gaze back to the stars. He whispered to the night, words Morty would not hear. "If remembering is all I can give you, then I'll give you that." His voice wavered, nearly lost to the air, but it steadied at the end. "You won't disappear, not while I'm still here." Above them, the crooked constellations shimmered unevenly, their light tilting across the ruins. The fountain's trickle kept its rhythm, and the plaza held them gently, as though promising to remember too. Rick let his body relax against the stone, not fully sleeping but resting deeper than he had in years. Morty's presence at his side was enough. The night stretched, timeless and calm, and somewhere in the ruins, memory quietly bloomed. The morning crept in slowly, though morning here was only a softer shade of night. The stars dimmed, but they never left. Rick stirred first, rubbing his eyes as if shaking off a heaviness he hadn't realized had settled in. Morty was still curled beside him, arms tucked in close, face relaxed in sleep. For a long time, Rick just watched him, the boy's steady breaths rising and falling like tides against the shore of silence. When Morty woke, he stretched with a groggy sigh. "What time is it?" he mumbled. Rick smirked faintly. "Time doesn't bother with us here, Morty. It just does what it wants." Morty blinked against the dim light.
"Then how do we know when to move on?"
Rick didn't answer right away. He looked around the plaza, at the fountain's faint shimmer, at the fragments of leaf and metal still waiting where they had been placed. "We'll know," he said eventually. "Places like this, they let you go when it's time." They walked together toward the edge of the ruins, their steps slower now, as though each stone they crossed was a farewell. Morty reached out occasionally to brush his fingers against the walls, the columns, even the weeds that had rooted through cracks. He wasn't trying to take anything with him. He was just reminding himself to notice, to hold it in memory. Rick saw the care in that gesture and felt an odd kind of pride, subtle but deep. At the far edge, they found a small archway half buried in vines. Morty tugged some of the growth aside, revealing carvings faded by age. They weren't words, at least not ones he could read, but shapes, spirals, circles, lines that seemed to fold back into themselves. Morty traced them with his fingertips. "What do you think they mean?" Rick tilted his head, studying the patterns.
"Could mean nothing. Could mean everything."
"Sometimes people carve just to remind themselves they existed." Morty smiled faintly. "Like my drawings." "Yeah," Rick murmured.
"Exactly like that." They lingered under the archway, letting the silence press against them.
Morty leaned into the stone, resting his head against it.
"I wish I knew their stories."
Rick crouched beside him. "You don't have to know them, Morty. It's enough to feel them. Stories don't always need words."
"Sometimes."
"They're carried in the way a place makes you breathe." Morty let out a slow exhale, as if practicing the truth of that. They continued walking, moving deeper into a part of the ruins they hadn't yet seen. The structures here were smaller, more intimate, fragments of what might have been homes. Morty crouched by a broken hearth, imagining fires once lit there. Rick touched a fragment of pottery, its curve still smooth against his hand. "This is where people lived," Morty whispered. Rick nodded.
Yeah, ordinary lives.
Cooking, sleeping, laughing.
Fighting too, probably.
Places like this held all of it. They walked further until they reached a courtyard. Unlike the Grand Plaza, this space was quiet and enclosed, the air still.
A single tree had grown at its center, twisted but alive.
Its branches reached outward unevenly, but its roots were strong, breaking through stone, yet holding the ground together. Morty approached it, placing his palm against the bark. "It feels warm," he said softly. Rick joined him, laying his own hand nearby. The bark was rough, but beneath it there was a faint vibration, almost like a pulse. Rick's brow furrowed.
Guess even ruins need guardians. Morty looked up at him.
"Do you think it remembers the people who lived here?" Rick exhaled, his voice low. "Maybe it remembers in the way it grew toward the light. Maybe it remembers in silence." They sat beneath the tree, leaning back against its trunk. Morty closed his eyes, listening to the quiet. Rick tilted his head, hearing the faint hum within the wood. For a while, neither spoke. There was no need. After some time, Morty whispered, "I think I'd like to be remembered like this tree, not with statues or big things, just by being part of the ground, by helping something else grow." Rick turned his head, studying the boy. His throat tightened before he spoke. "You're already doing that, Morty, more than you know." Morty's eyes opened slowly. He gave a small, sleepy smile. "Then maybe we're both trees now." Rick chuckled under his breath, the sound more tender than mocking.
Maybe we are. Evening slipped back across the ruins.
The stars brightened again, crooked but patient. The trees swayed faintly in the night air, as though acknowledging their presence. Morty leaned his head against Rick's shoulder, his voice drifting toward drowsiness.
"Do you think—"
"If we don't come back, it'll miss us?" Rick swallowed. "Yeah, Morty, I think it will." They stayed there until Morty's breathing deepened into sleep. Rick remained awake a little longer, staring at the branches above, watching how they framed the uneven constellations. He thought about memory, how it was less about what survived and more about what one chose to hold. He let his hand rest against the bark one last time, a silent promise shared between old wood and weary man. When he finally closed his eyes, the hum of the tree followed him, steady as a lullaby, carrying him gently toward rest. The final night came quietly, without warning. There was no shift in the stars, no sound to mark its arrival, only a stillness deeper than before, settling across the ruins like a blanket. Rick felt it first. He opened his eyes in the half-dark and knew, though he could not explain how, that this place was beginning to release them. Morty stirred beside him, rubbing his eyes. "Something feels different," he murmured. Rick nodded. "Yeah, the ruins know when it's time." They rose and walked slowly through the familiar paths. The fountain, the archway, the crumbled tower. Each place seemed to watch them as they passed, as if aware of the departure. Morty touched the stones lightly with his fingers, whispering soft goodbyes. Rick said nothing, but in his chest there was a quiet ache, a tenderness that surprised him. When they reached the courtyard with the tree, they stopped. The branches swayed, though no wind moved, as if acknowledging them. Morty stepped forward, placing his hand against the bark one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure what he was thanking it for. Perhaps for holding their silence, for being a companion in a place that might have felt empty without it. Rick joined him, resting his palm beside Morty's. He didn't speak, but the gesture carried his words. The tree's hum was faint, but steady, like a farewell. They sat beneath it, leaning back against the trunk. The night sky stretched above, filled with crooked constellations that seemed a little clearer now, as though the ruins had sharpened their light for this moment. Morty looked up, his voice soft.
"I don't want to forget this." Rick breathed deeply, his chest heavy.
"You won't. Not really."
"Places like this."
They stay with you, even when you leave. Morty's eyes lingered on the stars. Do you think we'll come back someday? Rick considered the question, then shook his head faintly.
Probably not.
But that doesn't mean we lose it.
Memory's its own kind of return. They fell into silence, letting the thoughts sink in.
Morty closed his eyes briefly, holding the memory already forming. Rick stayed awake, his gaze on the constellations. He thought of his old friend, of all the things he had failed to say, of how memory was sometimes all that remained, and for once he did not fight it. He let the weight of remembering sit gently in him, no longer a burden, but a gift. As the night deepened, Morty leaned against Rick's shoulder.
I think I understand now, he whispered sleepily. Rick glanced down. Understand what? That it's not about fixing everything.
It's about staying with it.
Even when it's broken. Rick swallowed hard, his throat tightening.
Yeah, Morty, that's it. The boy's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing slow and even. Rick stayed still, letting him rest. Above them, the stars shimmered softly, uneven yet beautiful, like flawed jewels scattered across the sky. When Morty finally slipped into sleep, Rick whispered into the night, words he had carried too long. I'm sorry. For all the times I couldn't stay. For all the doors I never opened. His voice cracked, but he steadied it. But I stayed here.
I stayed with him.
Maybe that's enough. The ruins held his words gently, as if absorbing them into their long memory. The tree hummed faintly, cradling the silence. Rick leaned his head back against the bark, closing his eyes. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to rest, without armor, without escape. And in that stillness, the night carried him toward a kind of peace. Not the kind that erases grief, but the kind that softens it, turning sharp edges into smooth stones. The crooked stars watched, steady and patient. The ruins whispered their farewell. The fountain trickled on, a heartbeat that would remain long after they were gone. Somewhere, far away, yet near, the memory of this night began to settle into the world. Not as a monument, not as a story carved in stone, but as a quiet promise between two travelers who had learned at last how to stay. Rick let his breath slow, his body sinking deeper into rest. He thought of all the places he had been, all the dimensions he had torn through, and realized that none of them mattered as much as this one night under crooked stars with Morty asleep at his side. He whispered one last line into the dark, meant for no one and everyone, "We'll be remembered, even if it's only by each other." The words hung in the air, soft as a lullaby, and then dissolved into silence. The stars flickered gently above. The trees stood strong at their backs, and the ruins held them in stillness. And with that, Rick stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man. Rick didn't expect to wake again after that last night. Yet he did. The ruins greeted him in silence, unchanged and patient. Morty was still asleep, curled on his side, a faint trace of a smile on his lips. Rick stayed still for a long while, simply listening to the boy's steady breathing, the gentle trickle of the fountain in the distance, the hum of the tree behind them. It was all the same, yet it felt different, as though each detail was offering itself as a farewell. When Morty stirred, he rubbed his eyes and whispered, "I thought we left already." Rick smirked faintly. "Guess we're still here." Morty looked around, confused but calm. "And maybe it's giving us one more night." Rick didn't argue. He stood, stretching slowly, his joints heavy with fatigue, but not with regret. They walked again, tracing the same paths through the plaza, the archway, the tower. Everything looked familiar, yet every step carried the weight of knowing it might be the last. Morty touched the stones again, though softer this time, almost reverent. At the fountain, Rick crouched and dipped his hand into the water. It was cool, clearer than he remembered. He let it run through his fingers, watching the drops vanish into the pool. "Funny thing about water," he said quietly. "It remembers the shape of every hand that touches it, but it never holds on." Morty crouched beside him, doing the same. "So it remembers, but it also lets go?" Rick nodded. "Yeah, both at once." They sat by the fountain until the stars tilted overhead, brighter now, sharper in their crooked lines. Morty leaned against Rick's arm, his voice soft.
"Do you think the stars here see us?"
Rick exhaled, staring up. "Maybe. Or maybe we just need to believe they do." They left the fountain and wandered back to the tree. The branches swayed gently, though again there was no wind. Morty rested his palm against the bark, and Rick did the same. The hum within it was steadier, almost stronger, as though it were holding their presence a little longer. "I think it doesn't want us to go yet," Morty whispered. Rick's eyes narrowed slightly. "Or maybe it's just reminding us we were here." They sat beneath it once more, leaning into its trunk. Morty tilted his head back, watching the stars through the branches. "If this is another night, what do we do with it?" Rick smirked faintly. "Same thing we've done every night. We sit, we breathe, we remember," and so they did. They let the night unfold without urgency. Rick told Morty small stories, not about adventures or inventions, but fragments of memory. A sandwich eaten in silence, a song half forgotten, the way a hallway used to smell of dust and sunlight. Morty listened, smiling sleepily, letting each story fall into him like pebbles into a pond. When Morty's eyelids grew heavy, Rick lowered his voice. "You know, Morty, sometimes the best nights aren't the ones with answers. They're the ones where you let yourself rest without needing them." Morty nodded faintly, drifting. "Then this is one of those nights." Rick stayed quiet after that, letting the boys slip into sleep. He watched the stars, the crooked constellations blinking their uneven rhythm. He thought about memory, about letting go, about how water remembers and releases at once. And he realized that he too was learning to do the same. The ruins did not press them to leave. They only held them gently, as though cradling their rest a little longer. The fountain trickled, the tree hummed, and the stars leaned low. Rick closed his eyes, his head against the bark, and whispered to no one and everyone, "Thank you." The word was quiet, fragile, but it carried all that needed to be said. The night deepened, folding over them like a blanket. Morty breathed softly in sleep. The trees swayed in silence, and Rick let himself rest once more without resistance. The last morning, in Dimension 35C, arrived like a whisper. There was no sunrise, no grand farewell, only a soft thinning of the shadows. Rick opened his eyes to the sight of Morty still curled close, the boys breathing slow, face turned toward the tree as though listening in dreams. Rick didn't move for a long while. He simply lay there, letting the stillness fill him, knowing this was the final gift the ruins would offer. When Morty finally stirred, he blinked into the dim light.
"Is it time now?"
he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. Rick nodded, slow and certain. "Yeah, Morty, it's time." They stood together, brushing the dust from their clothes. Rick looked once more at the plaza, at the fountain's steady trickle, at the leaf and fragment still resting where they had been left. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. Morty stepped toward the fountain and crouched, dipping his hand in one last time. He let the water drip from his fingers, watching the ripples fade. "Goodbye," he whispered. Rick watched him, saying nothing. Instead, he reached down, touched the surface too, and let the water run across his skin. It was cool, familiar now. He didn't say goodbye, but the silence held the word anyway. They made their way back toward the archway. The vines still curled across its face, the carvings still waiting. Morty traced them lightly with his fingertips, his expression calm.
"I think I'll remember these," he murmured. Rick glanced at him.
"That's all they ask." They walked further, past the broken tower, past the hearth, past the stones Morty had once marked with lines of dust. Every place felt like a farewell, but not a sorrowful one. More like the closing of a lullaby, the final notes trailing into silence. When they reached the tree again, they stopped. Its branches stretched unevenly, the bark still humming faintly beneath their palms. Morty leaned in, pressing his forehead against it. "Thank you," he said again, voice soft. Rick placed his hand beside Morty's, his eyes closed. The hum resonated through him, steady as a heartbeat. He exhaled slowly, almost in rhythm. For once there was no need for words. They sat beneath the tree a final time. Morty leaned against Rick's shoulder, and Rick let him. The stars glowed faintly overhead, though day pressed close. Crooked constellations bent in their uneven shapes, watching, waiting. "Do you think it will remember us?" Morty asked, his eyes half-lidded. Rick swallowed. "Yeah, Morty, I think it already does." They rested there until the air shifted, until even the ruins seemed to draw a final breath. Then Rick stood, pulling Morty gently to his feet. They looked back once more at the plaza, at the tree, at the stars, still visible in the pale sky. Morty's hand slipped into Rick's without thought, and Rick didn't pull away. Together, they stepped through the silence. The ruins did not vanish, but they softened behind them, fading like a dream remembered only in fragments. The fountain's trickle became memory. The tree's hum became heartbeat. The stars bent into the quiet of their minds. Rick and Morty walked on. They didn't speak, because words would only disturb the peace that had been given to them. They carried it with them instead, tucked into their breaths, into the slow rhythm of their steps. After a long while, Morty glanced up at Rick. "I think I'm not scared of disappearing anymore." Rick looked down at him, his throat tightening.
"Good," he whispered. "That's good." They walked further, the silence deepening, softening, holding them. Rick let out a final breath, one that felt like release, one that felt like forgiveness.
And somewhere in the distance, the ruins seemed to exhale with him. The crooked stars leaned low, uneven but steady. The tree stood, rooted in memory. The fountain trickled on, and Rick, weary but gentle now, let the silence close around them like a blanket. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man."